Gynecomastia. The core irony of taking male hormones is that they can give a man breast tissue. The body doesn't simply use all the testosterone it receives. A portion of it converts to estrogen through a process called aromatization. When synthetic testosterone is running at many times the natural level, estrogen rises as a byproduct. An elevated estrogen in men stimulates breast tissue growth. This isn't fat accumulating in the chest. Gynecomastia is glandular tissue forming directly beneath the nipple. It's firm, distinct, and it doesn't resolve on its own once it's established. The particularly cruel detail is that it can develop even while total testosterone is running extremely high. Aromatization produces enough estrogen to trigger the process regardless of what the testosterone numbers say. Someone can have both simultaneously, which illustrates the gap between what people expect the drug to do and what the body actually does with it. Drugs like tamoxifen are commonly used alongside cycles to block estrogen from acting on breast tissue. As a preventive measure, they work. Once actual glandular tissue has formed, medication doesn't remove it. The fix at that point is surgical, specifically a subcutaneous mastectomy. This isn't a rare outcome, it's one of the more frequently reported side effects among users, and there are dedicated sections of online communities where people compare surgical consultations and recovery timelines, not the communities anyone pictured being in when they started. Testicular atrophy. The hypothalamus monitors circulating hormone levels constantly. When it detects that testosterone is well supplied, it signals the pituitary to back off on LH production. LH is the hormone that tells the testes to produce testosterone. Without that signal, the testes reduce activity. An organ not being asked to do much gradually gets smaller. The reduction in size during longer or heavier cycles isn't subtle. Users notice. Recovery after stopping typically takes several months as the hormonal feedback loop reactivates. But typically and guaranteed are different words, and several months is not nothing. Fertility gets caught in the same crossfire. FSH, the hormone driving sperm production, gets suppressed alongside LH. For most users, this recovers. Some have discovered the hard way that they weren't in the majority. Hair loss. Male pattern baldness runs on a timeline that's partly genetic and partly hormonal. Steroids accelerate the hormonal side significantly. Testosterone converts to a compound called DHT through an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. DHT miniaturizes hair follicles in people who are genetically susceptible to it. The follicles don't disappear immediately. They shrink progressively with each hair cycle until eventually they stop producing hair altogether. When steroid use raises circulating androgen levels, more DHT circulates, and the genetic timeline speeds up. Someone who might have started thinning in their mid-40s could find themselves a decade or more ahead of that schedule. This is a one-way door. Stopping a cycle doesn't restore follicles that have already miniaturized. There is no recovery window for hair loss this way. Finasteride can slow the process but carries its own documented side effects, including sexual dysfunction. So addressing the hair loss means picking between two separate problems. The classic image of big physique, shaved head, is not always a style choice. Acne. The acne that comes with steroid use isn't the kind of face wash handles. Androgens push the sebaceous glands into overdrive. Those glands control oil production, and when androgen levels run significantly above baseline, they don't scale modestly. They go hard. What follows is typically cystic acne across the back and chest. Painful, inflamed, the kind that leaves permanent scarring. Someone already dealing with hormonal acne before starting a cycle can expect it to get considerably worse. Some users end up on Accutane, a drug normally reserved for teenagers with severe cystic acne. In adults, it carries its own list of side effects, including liver strain, which is a preview of things further down this list. The acne itself tends to improve after a cycle ends, but repeated breakout scarring is permanent, and for people running back-to-back cycles without meaningful time off, the skin barely recovers between them. Dermatologists can often identify steroid users from the pattern and distribution of breakouts alone. It has a recognizable signature. Aggression. Roid rage is real, but the phrase makes it sound more cinematic than it actually presents. The documented reality is subtler and easier to miss until it isn't. What steroid use tends to produce is a lower threshold for irritability. The same situation someone would normally process and move past generates a sharper response. Impulsivity increases. The internal buffer that keeps everyday frustrations from becoming something you say out loud or act on gets thinner, not constant volcanic anger. More like the dial on everything gets turned up, including responses that would otherwise stay scaled down. Trenbolone has a particularly consistent reputation in user communities for pronounced psychological effects. The accounts across different communities align closely enough that even in groups broadly favorable towards steroid use, Trenbolone gets specifically flagged as the compound that meaningfully changes how people think and behave during a cycle. The relationship damage from this tends to be quieter than the visible physical changes and longer lasting. Partners and family members are operating with a version of someone who isn't running at their usual calibration, and they typically notice the shift before the user does. Post-cycle depression. When a cycle ends, the synthetic testosterone is gone, but the body's natural production, suppressed throughout the cycle, hasn't come back yet. The hypothalamic pituitary axis needs time to reactivate, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, depending on how long and how heavily it was suppressed. During that window, testosterone is genuinely low, and genuinely low testosterone produces recognizable symptoms. Depression is what most people mean when they describe the post-cycle crash, but the full picture includes fatigue, brain fog, loss of motivation, and a flattened libido that makes ordinary daily function feel effortful. Some people describe this period as among the worst stretches they've been through, not because anything happened externally, because the hormonal baseline that makes everyday life feel manageable simply isn't there. Estrogen compounds this. Elevated during the cycle, it drops when the cycle ends. The combination of low testosterone and volatile estrogen creates a hormonal environment that's hard to stay stable in. Post-cycle therapy using drugs like tamoxifen or clomiphene is designed to accelerate the restart of natural production. It helps. It doesn't eliminate the crash entirely. This phase is probably the clearest driver of continued use among long-term users, not the disappearing gains. Though those are real, the motivation to go back on tends to have more to do with the fact that being off-cycle feels genuinely bad enough that staying on seems like the easier path. That's how a planned cycle becomes year-round use. Testosterone suppression. The central paradox of taking exogenous testosterone is that it destroys the body's ability to produce its own. The hypothalamic pituitary testicular axis runs as a feedback loop. The hypothalamus monitors circulating testosterone levels. When they're sufficient, it signals the pituitary to reduce LH and FSH output. LH tells the testes to produce testosterone. FSH drives sperm production. When synthetic testosterone floods the system, the hypothalamus reads levels as more than adequate, and the entire natural production chain goes quiet. For a single cycle of moderate length, this is often reversible. Stop the cycle, the feedback loop reactivates, and hormone levels return to something close to baseline within a few months. Often is doing serious work in that sentence. Long-term users, or those who've run particularly heavy or extended cycles, can end up in a state called secondary hypogonadism. The natural production axis, suppressed for long enough, doesn't reliably come back online. There are men who entered steroid use expecting it to function as a temporary tool and came out requiring testosterone replacement therapy indefinitely. The hormone they were supplementing, they can no longer produce themselves. This is documented, not speculative, not a fringe case. The medical literature and the accounts of users who've been through it say the same thing. Enlarged heart. Former steroid users, years after stopping, have been found with measurably reduced cardiac function, not during use, after. That's what makes this different from almost everything else on this list. The heart is a muscle, and like all muscles, it responds to sustained demand by adapting. In naturally trained athletes, the heart develops what's known as athlete's heart. The chambers expand slightly, the walls thicken modestly, and the whole organ becomes more efficient at pumping blood. The heart stays flexible, fills well, empties well. The heart wall thickens from steroid use, but instead of staying flexible, it stiffens. A thicker, stiffer wall doesn't fill with blood as well between beats. The heart ends up pushing out a smaller percentage of what it holds with each contraction, even as it grows physically larger. More work, less output. When steroid use stops, blood pressure can normalize, cholesterol can recover, and blood thickness can return to a safe range. The heart wall doesn't follow that pattern. Studies tracking long-term users have found reduced cardiac function persisting years after they stopped. The heart doesn't fully return what was taken from it. Sudden cardiac death in young, physically imposing men with no obvious external warning signs has been linked to this kind of enlarged, stiffened heart across multiple documented cases. The profile is consistent every time. Young, big, apparently healthy. The warning signs only show up on a scan nobody thought to run. Thickened heart muscle conducts electrical signals differently, which is why irregular heartbeats are more common in long-term users. In a heart where the walls have been permanently remodeled, an irregular beat can be the last one. Liver damage. Not all steroids affect the liver equally. The ones that do the most damage are oral compounds specifically modified to survive first-pass liver metabolism. Without modification, testosterone taken orally gets broken down before it reaches the bloodstream. To get around that, certain oral steroids are chemically altered at a specific position in the molecule, making them resistant to liver breakdown. The liver still has to try though, and that sustained effort shows up in elevated liver enzymes and, with prolonged use, more serious conditions. With prolonged use, the liver liver can stop draining bile properly, which backs up and causes jaundice, persistent itching, and serious abdominal pain. In more severe cases, pockets of blood start forming inside the liver tissue itself. Long-term, high-dose oral use has also been associated with liver tumors, though this risk is better established in cases involving very high doses across many years. Injectable steroids bypass first-pass metabolism and are considerably less liver toxic, but the kidneys take their own hit from elevated creatinine loads, high protein intake, and the chronic dehydration that tends to accompany heavy training. Kidney damage in long-term users is documented. It just tends to get buried under everything the liver is doing at the same time. High blood pressure. Steroids cause sodium retention, and sodium holds water. More fluid in the circulatory system means more pressure against vessel walls. Some steroids also convert to estrogen in the body, and that elevated estrogen adds another layer of water retention on top of that. The water retention comes with a cosmetic irony worth noting. The same cycle adding muscle is often simultaneously making the physique look less defined than it would off-cycle. The retained fluid sits just under the skin, blurring the definition that was the entire point of the effort. The word watery shows up constantly in these discussions for a reason. Chronically elevated blood pressure does damage that isn't felt in real time. Arterial walls take sustained stress. Stroke risk climbs. In isolation, moderate blood pressure elevation in a healthy person is manageable. In someone whose heart wall is already thickening, whose blood is getting more viscous, and whose cholesterol is heading the wrong direction, elevated blood pressure is adding load to a system already getting hit from multiple directions at once. You'll find guys tracking every gram of protein and every rep they've ever lifted who haven't checked their blood pressure once. Cholesterol disruption. Steroids push the lipid profile in a reliably bad direction. HDL, the type that clears out your arteries, drops substantially. Documented cases with heavy oral steroid use show HDL falling to 20 or below. The normal minimum for men is around 40. LDL, the type that causes plaque buildup, tends to increase at the same time. This combination causes the arteries to gradually narrow and harden. On its own, a poor lipid profile is a slow-moving problem that takes decades to become catastrophic. Running alongside elevated blood pressure, structural cardiac changes, and blood that's thickening, the cardiovascular risk starts compressing timelines in ways that don't accommodate long-term plans. Cholesterol does tend to normalize after cycling stops, which is a relative bright spot compared to most of this list. But repeated cycles, each crashing the lipid profile and recovering it, likely accumulate arterial damage that doesn't show clearly on routine blood work until it shows up as a heart attack or a stroke. Tendon damage. Muscle tissue responds to androgens quickly. The receptors are there, the signaling pathway is active, and meaningful strength increases can arrive within weeks. Tendon tissue doesn't share that relationship with androgens. It adapts through mechanical loading, slowly, through a collagen remodeling process that hormonal changes can't speed up. The mismatch is predictable. Someone whose muscle strength increases significantly over a short period is placing forces on tendons that haven't adapted to carry the new load. You can bench significantly more than you could 8 weeks ago, but your pectoralis tendon is still operating at 8 weeks ago capacity. Pectoralis major tears, bicep tendon ruptures, and quadriceps tendon injuries are all reported at higher rates among steroid users. These are not minor strains. A complete pectoralis tear requires surgery and months of rehabilitation, and full strength doesn't always come back. There's enough video documentation of these happening mid-lift that the mechanism isn't ambiguous. Some evidence also suggests that certain anabolic compounds may directly inhibit collagen synthesis, meaning tendons could be weakening structurally during periods of significant muscle growth. The research isn't fully settled, but the clinical injury rate among users is notable enough on its own, regardless of mechanism. Sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is when your airway collapses during sleep, cutting off your breathing. Your body wakes you up to reopen it, sometimes dozens of times a night, and you often have no memory of any of it. You just know you slept 8 hours and still feel wrecked. Steroids cause muscle growth throughout the body, including the muscles lining the upper airway. When those muscles thicken, the airway narrows. Additional body mass from a cycle adds external pressure around the neck and throat. During sleep, when everything relaxes, a narrowed airway is far more likely to collapse. Repeatedly stopping and restarting breathing through the night puts serious strain on the cardiovascular system, on top of everything else it's already dealing with. Sleep quality tanks even when the hours look fine on paper. Recovery from training suffers. Some users attribute the persistent fatigue to their training load or diet, never connecting it to a sleep disorder the same compound is causing. Blood thickening. When blood gets too thick, it doesn't flow properly, clots form more easily, and the heart has to work harder to push it through. Steroids trigger exactly that. Testosterone signals the body to produce more red blood cells. In a healthy man, roughly half the blood volume is made up of red blood cells. Steroid use can push that figure to 60% or higher. At those levels, the blood stops flowing as freely, and the heart is working harder with every beat. Thick, slow-moving blood clots more easily. Clots forming in the legs can break off and travel to the lungs, blocking blood flow there. Clots reaching the brain cause strokes. There are documented cases of young, physically capable men having strokes where the contributing factor in their blood work was an extreme excess of red blood cells from steroid use. Some users monitor their red blood cell count and donate blood regularly to keep it in a safe range. This works as a strategy. It's worth noting that the strategy is managing a risk the drug created. Put this together with elevated blood pressure, disrupted cholesterol, and structural cardiac changes, and the cardiovascular picture across this list isn't a collection of separate risks that happen to coexist. They compound. Addiction. The dependency that develops with steroid use doesn't look like a classic addiction. There's no acute physical craving. What there is, a post-cycle crash that feels genuinely terrible, a physique that changes significantly within weeks of stopping, and an identity that can become substantially built around how the body looks and performs. For a lot of long-term users, going back on isn't a conscious decision. The crash is bad enough, the alternative discouraging enough, that continuing just happens. What started as a planned cycle becomes year-round use not through deliberate choice, but because stopping becomes progressively harder to choose.